One thing I've heard you talk about is the fact that the first meal of the day, we want to make sure we're getting a good bolus of protein.
Yeah.
So, what does that look like and why is that so important?
The traditional research in dietary protein really stems from that first meal of the day. So really all the data has all been at breakfast. It typically is not done at lunch or at dinner. And the reason is it's just easy from a scientific standpoint to be able to leverage that first meal of the day because it doesn't have all those confounding variables. You're coming off of an overnight fast. And so the data for muscle protein synthesis typically is really the primary point is that first meal of the day. It allows for, whether someone is doing a clamp or someone is doing like a muscle biopsy. And so the majority of the research has really identified that first meal is very valuable, right? And that's where the data has typically come from out of Don Lehman's lab and many others. So why is it so important? Well, number one, we have evidence to support the impact that it has on muscle protein synthesis. And muscle protein synthesis is a surrogate for, it's not a direct correlation. So you don't stimulate muscle protein synthesis one time and all of a sudden you have like a bicep that looks like Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not what that is. But muscle protein synthesis is the best marker that we have for the laying down of new proteins over time, right? And muscle protein synthesis is very robust at that first meal, coming off of an overnight fast where essentially the skeletal muscle is catabolic in an unfed state. And that first meal, you will likely get the biggest influence from the amino acids. Because, we don't really know what happens. It's very difficult for us to look at dinner and lunch. But that first meal, we know. And so we know that coming off after an overnight fast, that the muscle is primed for nutrients. It's hungry, essentially, and primed for nutrients. And really hitting 30 to 50 grams to stimulate that muscle protein synthesis is ideal. And that number really comes from an amino acid threshold. And the amino acid particularly is leucine. And if you are plant-based, you'll need to go to the 50 grams or higher. If you are more animal-based high-quality proteins, 30 to 50 grams would be ideal.
I want to get into the nuance of this a little bit more. So we got muscle protein synthesis. So we're having this bolus of protein. Is this basically the laying down and the building up of our current muscle?
Muscle protein synthesis over time, that's the belief. So over time, muscle protein synthesis is the laying down and building up. But again, I caution the listener to think about it that way because it's very incremental. It's very incremental over a period of time.
And I'm curious for somebody that does a workout, say the day before, versus somebody that isn't working out or they've just taken a break and they're not working out, for a few days, how does that protein impact the muscle differently in those two different states?
So if someone is not working out versus working out, well, you can't.
Yeah, picture somebody that worked out the day before and then they hit that protein bolus the next morning versus somebody that's taken a break a few days from working out or they're a sedentary person. How is that going to interact with the muscle differently?
Again, a great question. Definitely asked by a seasoned interviewer. The sedentary muscle, from my perspective overall, is unhealthy muscle. Sedentary muscle is typically muscle that's already kind of saturated full of glycogen, fatty acid substrates like diacylglycerol, those kinds of things. However, I will say that muscle still needs amino acids. It needs amino acids for recovery and repair, even if, you're not totally utilizing it. Because skeletal muscle does go through a turnover process, right? There's tissue turnover in every part of the body. Again, minimum of 250 grams a day we're probably turning over. So a non-exercising muscle that is fasted is still primed for muscle protein synthesis. But again, this is a very nuanced question. Is that sedentary muscle obese? If it is, it's probably going to take more protein to actually create a stimulus effect. But if the person is lean, a 30 to 50 gram amount would be perfectly adequate. Now, Let's take this one step further. If an individual is an older muscle, so let's say it's an older individual who is sedentary, I still recommend this bolus amount of protein. And I'd probably push them to the higher end of, say, 50 grams of protein. And the reason is because it will trigger a response that would be essentially youthful, like a youthful response, meaning muscle is this nutrient sensing organ. Its capacity to sense nutrient decreases as an individual ages. There's some question whether that is true or if it's just inactivity. But either way, if you are sedentary and obese, 50 grams. If you are older and or obese or not obese, 50 grams. If you are younger and healthy and active, you can get away with 30 grams.
From your experience, how many people do you feel like are hitting even that 30-gram threshold?
Yeah. So the NHANES data, which is the largest data set, would suggest that, 50% of women over the age, I think it's like over the age of 50, are not meeting their dietary protein needs. Don't quote me on that, but it's something like that the average woman is getting 68 grams of protein a day, and the average male, according to this NHANES data set, is getting about 100 grams of protein.
If you enjoyed that clip, press here for the full episode. I'll see you over there.
People say they don't have time. And the reality is, if you don't have time for fitness, then how do you think you're going to have time for sickness? I think that we have a muscle crisis, not an obesity crisis. And that's why I do what I do. I do what I do because if you have a capacity